All right. We're in Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. Mark 13. A lot of people look at Mark 13 as well as Matthew 24 and Luke 21 as being a teaching about the end times, about Jesus looking forward to his second coming. However, I think when we get into Mark 13, one of the things that we're going to see is that Mark 13, as well as those parallel passages in Matthew 24 and Luke 21, and when we look at those carefully, we'll see that the teachings of Jesus needs to be understood as it would have been understood by those that were with him on that day. I think a lot of times we try to make, not we, but a lot of times Bible students try to make application first before we really grasp what the meaning of the text would have been to the original audience. And sure, application can be made even when that application may not have been pertinent to the ones who were hearing him on that day, but it can't mean something that it didn't mean in that day. It can't have a meaning that it didn't have in the day that Jesus speaks these words. So even though there may be a title here that talks about the end of the age, which there is in many of the Bibles, the signs of the end of the age, even if you use that phrase and understand that Jesus is talking about the end of an age and the end of the age of Judaism, the end of the temple, the end of Judaism as it was known at that time, and it would be the destruction of the temple. It would be the great destruction of all the things that would be Jewish in nature. And it all stems from two things, I think, that we find in these first couple of verses and in the last couple of verses in this passage that's going to describe, I think, what that's going to give the meaning to the passage, and it being not the end of the world or not the coming of Jesus in that manner, but it's going to be the way that it is described here as being the answer to the questions that the disciples asked. So in the first couple of verses, you find the very critical setting that needs to be really honed down before we define what Jesus answers, because the questions that they ask or the observations that they make are very important. So notice 13 verses 1 and 2. As he came out of the temple, one of the disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So that kind of gives you a setting as to what the next words are going to refer to. Now remember that what's been happening now is that Jesus in chapter 12 has been talking about the end of the age of Judaism. Remember the fig tree? It appears to be one thing, or it promises one thing, and it's not, and therefore the withering of the fig tree, I think, is a way that Jesus is teaching about the coming of the end of the age of Judaism. When you continue to look through it, you see how he looked at the scribes and Pharisees, and he talked about how that you needed to beware of those scribes and Pharisees because they appear to be one way, but they are another. And then he talks about this greater condemnation, which I think is going to be this coming to an end of all of this. And so I think chapter 12 has just been this series of declarations about the coming of the end of the Jewish age. And so when the question is asked, chapter 13, verse 1, one of his disciples asked him this question or made this statement, said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones, what wonderful buildings." What was the reference to there? Why was that brought up? What was the context of the disciple observing about these great buildings? Had the disciple grasped the fact that many others seem to not be able to grasp, that there was coming an end to all of this? There was going to be a time, there was going to be this moment sometime in the future when all of this is going to come to an end. Did he grasp that? And is that why he asked that question? So Jesus had condemned the religious leaders, chapter 12. He had condemned the nation of Judah. He had condemned them and let the ones who were listening to his teaching know that the end is near and there's coming a time when they'll no longer exist. And so now the question is asked, and that is, when you talk about the coming of the end of these great things, look at all of these great things. Look at the way they're all so beautiful and so strong. The idea of them being torn down would be far from the mind of most who might be well aware of who they are and what these are. Many would look at, I think, a parallel to that when the nation of Judah would fall. I think nobody really believed that it was going to happen. I think when 586, 587, it ultimately did fall. And I think most of the nation of Israel just didn't believe that was going to happen, but it did. And so when you parallel those Old Testament passages, it's going to be very similar because, for instance, the prophet Jeremiah is going to talk about this destruction that's coming, and he's going to give some hint to the fact that there is disbelief among the people that this is actually going to happen. The Jewish leaders wouldn't listen to Jeremiah. They imprisoned him even because of his message. And so God was planning for the destruction of Jerusalem, and it happened in Jeremiah's time. God is planning for judgment to come upon the nation of Judah, and Jesus makes this statement in verse 2. When you look at all of these great buildings and you see all these great things, I want you to know that there's coming a time when there will be not one stone left upon another, that all will be thrown down. That's chapter 13, verse 2. So in that context, you see that Jesus plainly states and implied, again, kind of straightforward, outright says what he had implied over in chapter 12 over and over about the coming of the end of these things. The parables he'd given in prior times and the last couple of days back over in chapter 12. Anyone like to make any observations or maybe ask a question or anything over those first couple of verses? All right, beginning in verse 3, you have this long teaching that actually goes all the way through 23, and then you could really put it in the context of 24 through 27. So you've really got this very long teaching that begins with questions, chapter 13, verses 3 and 4, and Jesus begins to answer those questions, verse 5, and you'll notice that Jesus then speaks all the way through the end of the chapter, all the way till you start chapter 14. All of that is teaching from Jesus after he has asked these questions in chapter 13, verses 3 and 4. So Jesus leaves the temple, goes to the Mount of Olives, which is opposite the Temple Mount, and it's, I think the setting is important because he's going to be within sight of, or at least within that boundary of being able to to even point to the temple proper and be able to point there and say, there you have that. So he's opposite the Temple Mount. Maybe it's in his sight line as he's teaching. And so he begins his teaching once the questions are asked. So let's just look at the questions, 13, 3, and 4. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" And verse 5, and Jesus began to say to them. Okay? So let's stop right there, because the important thing that we need to capture right here is the setting of these questions. And what are these questions? What's the context of these questions? Well, the context goes with chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. He's sitting in the Mount of Olives. You have these 4 disciples who come to him, and they ask these questions. Or this is what they say. Tell us when all of these things will be. So that's their first question. When will this happen? The second question is, what will be the sign when these things are about to be accomplished? So the second question is, what can we look for that's going to tell us that the time is near? Isn't that what they're asking? What can we see that's happening around us so we'll know that the time that you're talking about, where these stones will be, not one stone will be left on another, there'll be this great destruction. When is it going to happen? And the second part of that is, will there be signs that will clue us into the fact that this is about to happen? That context, chapters 13, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, in that context, when you get all of that together, you see that what is taking place is Jesus teaching about the destruction of Jerusalem, and the disciples' questions are concerning this great devastation. Later on, it's going to be called by a couple of different names. Abomination of desolation in chapter 13, verse 14. It's going to talk about, call it tribulation in chapter 13, verse 19, and a couple other times it's going to call it tribulation, I think, as well. But the context of this magnificent event is described here in 13, 1 through 4. And it is the destruction of Jerusalem. These stones are going to fall. These wonderful buildings are not going to be the same. They're not going to be here. These great buildings will not be left, because it's all going to be torn down. When's it going to happen, and how will we know when it's about to happen? So then it stands to reason that what follows would be Jesus' answer to these 2 questions, doesn't it? Wouldn't it be these 2 questions that Jesus would answer? Now, it's possible that at times Jesus answered a question that he wasn't asked, but in the context, I think we have to assume that what Jesus answers is the questions he was asked. So what's going to take place now is the answers that Jesus gives, or the answer, I guess, the answers to the 2 questions, or the answer that they're seeking. And so that begins in the second part of verse 5. Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray." And then we're going to get into that. But before we go on into chapter 13, verse 5, any comments that you'd like to make concerning those 2 verses, 3 and 4, or even back to verses 1 and 2? Okay, did the disciples ask when the end of the world was coming? I mean, they didn't ask that, did they? Did they ask about the end of time? Did they ask when Jesus was coming back? No, they didn't even know anything about that, very likely. There was none of that somewhere right along in this time is when Jesus is going to be teaching them, and this is going to be recorded by John, especially when Jesus is going to be teaching them about um, um, going to prepare a place for you, and I'm going to come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. That's John 14. So it's somewhere right in this general area, because chapter 14, Jesus is going to be arrested. In chapter 14, you have the institution of the Lord's Supper. That's the middle of the chapter. And then you have Peter's denial, Jesus' arrest, and all of that happens in chapter 14. So it's very close to the time when he's going to begin to explain to them about how he's going to prepare heaven for them. But not at this point. There's no grasping, I think, that there's going to be this heavenly reward. Maybe, but I don't know. So their questions are clear. So Jesus then is going to begin to answer these questions. Verses, 5 and following. And it's a long reading. And because of our time, let me see if I can just kind of summarize some things that he speaks of, and some of the things that are significant, because what he's going to begin to do in verses 5 through 13 is to describe the events that will happen before the destruction of Jerusalem. So you have that in verses 5 through 13. Many things that are described by those who want to make these verses relate to the end of time and the second coming of Jesus, and they'll use these verses. And here's what they say. Verse 5, see that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes, various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of birth pains. Now, I'm not going to spend time here talking against false beliefs. We're just going to try to talk about the truth. But the idea of birth pains is often one of those points that's taken and run with. I mean, there are whole sermon series that have been preached by those who believe this is an end times prophecy, that they will take that idea of birth pains and run with it. What Jesus is saying, by the way, what does a birth pain represent? So if a woman has birth pains, what's next? A baby, yeah, it's delivery. It's going to be it's going to be the reality of what all of this has been. So Jesus is describing the working of God up to this time, and all of these things that are happening are described as like being birth pains until the event takes place. There are going to be wars and rumors of wars. There are going to be desolation, famine. There are going to be strife. All of these things that are going on, and you can just be assured that all of these things are going to happen. And these things are birth pains that are leading you up. The thing that you know that's going to happen is there's going to be this revealing of what you've been waiting on all this time. So that's all he's saying, I think, and that is that you have all of these things going on: earthquakes, famines, wars, all this stuff's going on. These are the beginning of things that point to that final moment when the thing you've asked me is going to happen. So, the wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and famines, there is nothing new there. There's nothing that hasn't been happening. But I think what would be very significant is to understand that you have, for instance, when Jesus is teaching the disciples in John 14, 15 and 16, even 17 when we have the Lord's Prayer. In those chapters, you have the largest number of verses that teach about the Holy Spirit in any context, in anywhere, in any other book of the Bible. And so you have this recording of the Holy Spirit, which will lead them and guide them and give them what to say. And Jesus says in verse 11, notice we didn't go that far, but verse 9 through 11, we'll stop there. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you'll be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations, and when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you will say, but say whatever is given you in the hour, for it is not you who speaks, but the Holy Spirit. Now what happened in John 14, 15, 16, Jesus has said, I'm going to give you the Holy Spirit, I'm going to leave, I'm going to give you the Holy Spirit, it's going to lead you and guide you into all things, what to say. In this context, isn't it clear that when you read verses 9 and following, that he's talking specifically to his apostles about this same time frame of the birth pains, that they're going to arrest you, they're going to put you on trial, they're going to do all of this to you because you are witnesses before them for my name's sake. Now, that's the application. That's what's going on right here in the context of this chapter. And he's talking to his disciples. And note verse 10. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. The book of Acts records that having been done, doesn't it? The book of Acts says that they turned the whole world upside down, preaching the gospel. That the gospel went into every nation under heaven. So the book of Acts is a record of the fulfillment of that. And when did that first gospel sermon happen? Well, it was about 33 and a half AD, something like that. So the temple still has about, 37 more years to be active? The gospel in the next 37 years puts Paul in Rome preaching the gospel to the ends of the earth, which is described Acts chapter 1, verse 8. You'll be my witnesses beginning in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Depending on your translation, that's the end of the world or the ends of the earth, or however your translation says it. The gospel had been made known to all nations. There are at least a half a dozen verses. If you want to look at a couple, Colossians 1:6, Romans 16:26, the gospel had been made known. Jesus then calls them here to endure through all of these difficulties to the end. Now let's continue, verse 12. Brother will deliver brother over to death, father his child, children will rise against parents and have them put to death. You'll be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Okay, let's just be the devil's advocate here and say this is end times prophecy. How does verse 13 factor in when he talks about salvation? Now, I know how those that teach this as end time do it, but do you see the contradiction? Because he's talking to the disciples about enduring through persecution and enduring to the end, and it's only going to get worse before it gets better. So you endure to the end, and so the one who endures to the end will be saved. If I'm a Christian, when the Lord comes back, I don't have to endure to be saved. Do I? I mean, if I see him in the eastern skies, isn't that the song that says, if I see him, then whew, good, come Lord, I'm ready to go. There's no need to endure to the end in order to be saved. So he's talking to these disciples. You're going to be persecuted. You're bearing witness for my name's sake, and because you're doing that, they are going to persecute you, and it'll be persecution, brother against brother, family against family. The idea is you don't know who's going to be the one persecuting you. You just don't know. It's going to be a worldwide persecution, and he who you're going to be hated for my name's sake, verse 13. All right, any observations through verse 12, through verse 13? Okay, 14 through 23, he's going to talk about more of these signs. He's going to talk about some very significant things. One of those that I think proves beyond any doubt that what Jesus is talking about here is the destruction of Jerusalem is verse 14, when he says, "But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Now there are a lot of references in the Old Testament to, well, I say a lot. There are some references in the Old Testament to this idea of abomination of desolation. One of those is in Daniel. I believe it's Daniel 9, maybe Daniel 9 and 11, I think. But in that idea of the abomination of desolation, what Daniel is talking about is an enemy attacking a city. There's this abomination of desolation. The enemy marauders come in and they rack the city, and that's the idea of abomination of desolation. And the one standing, that is one who stands where he ought not to be, would be that victorious, would be a general, I guess. Well, whatever he would be with that army, the one that's victorious, he's standing where he ought not to be. Can you imagine any greater thrill of this marauding army who comes into Jerusalem, and the very heart, the very center of all that's Jewish, and the heart of the Jewish nation, and you hate them with all you've got, and you hate them with a passion, and you stand in their temple courts violating their sanctity and their holiness. You stand violating that. And that's exactly what happened. Let the one who's on the housetop not go down nor enter the house to take anything out. Let the one who's on the field not turn back to cloak. This is a statement by Jesus that says, when you see the army coming, run. Isn't that what it says? Don't worry about grabbing anything. Don't you worry about doing anything, because the city of Jerusalem is going to be sacked, and if you're in it, you're going to pay. Don't hang around. Don't say, well, I'm just going to wait it out in my house, because nobody's going to survive. You're not. So Jesus is saying, when this foreign army comes, when you hear that they are coming, I hope before you see the dust of their horses and hear the clanging of their shields, before any of that happens, I hope you're gone. Because if you're not, if you wait till the last minute, it's going to be bad. You're going to be in real trouble. Again, the abomination of desolation is not a strange term. It is to us, but it's not a strange term. And Jesus is simply describing, I think, a marauding enemy who comes in, and Jesus says, if you are aware of this, when you hear of this coming, the one thing that you need to make sure you do is to get out, is to flee, and to go as fast and as far as you can. Flee to the mountains. Verse 14. All right, any observations? All right, because of time, let's skip on to verse 24. 24 through 31. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says pray that it doesn't happen in the winter, which we can relate to that because the worst thing that I can think of is to have to grab anything I can and get out of here in the wintertime. Yeah, yeah, that's exactly. He's just continuing to describe how you need to get out of there. You need to run. Okay. Anything else? All right, look at 24. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give light, stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man come in clouds, great power, glory, and he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Now, the reason I want to skip to that is because that's a very significant paragraph that really describes, for those who believe this to be end times, to be the coming of the Lord. And I believe there are some within the church who believe that you may have heard someone do this before, but that there's actually a stop there in verse 23 where he stops talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and begins to talk about the second coming of the Lord. There are those who believe that. I've heard the teaching from Matthew 24 about that very same thing, that when you get to a certain point, he stops teaching about the destruction of Jerusalem and begins to teach about the end times. I think it's all still within the context. We're not going to fall out over it, but I think it's still within that context. The text says that there are a lot of things that are going to happen, a lot of things that are really wild and strange. And it concerns the day of the Lord. Now, let's look at a similar passage in Isaiah 13. So if you go to Isaiah 13 with me, and I think this, for me, it clears it up. Isaiah 13, verses 9 through 13. Now listen to what this says. Behold, the day of the Lord comes. Similar phrasing. What is the day of the Lord? Okay. It comes cruel with wrath and fierce anger to make the land desolate, to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations and not give their light. The sun will be dark as its rising. The moon will not shed its light. I will punish the world for evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant, lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless. I will make people more rare than fine gold, mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore, I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place. My pages are stuck together. All the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger. Now, that's similar language. It's very similar language, but when you start in chapter 13, verse 1, you see that this is an oracle concerning the destruction of Babylon. Chapter 13, verse 1, the oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. So if you've got that kind of language in Isaiah, and you've got similar language in Mark, and you've got similar language in Joel, and Peter even quotes that similar language in Joel, Acts chapter 2, what's all this got to do with anything? Well, in chapter 13 of Isaiah, it is about the destruction of a nation. In chapter 13, verse 24 and following in the Gospel of Mark, I believe that it's talking about the same thing. It is the day of the Lord, the visitation of the Lord upon the nation of Israel. It's going to be his judgment upon them. It's going to be his judgment. Now, you have that similar language, the moon dark and the sun dark, the moon the blood, and all that Joel uses in Joel chapter 2, and then Peter quotes it in Acts chapter 2, and really the language that's used by the prophets of old, Peter interprets it and says, this is what Joel's talking about. This day, This day, a colossal day, a day that will go down in history, a day that where you can drive a stake down that changed the world forever because it's the day that the gospel came into being. So Peter says this is the day Joel's talking about, and I think that Jesus quotes that, doesn't quote that, but Jesus uses those similar words to talk about the coming of the destruction of the nation of Israel. And by the way, he kind of adds it all up in 32 and following when he says nobody knows the day or the hour, nobody knows when it's going to be. So don't keep yourself up at night trying to figure it all out, I think. All right, any observations? I think my time's up. All right, thank you.